And it always had to be that one part of the story that was sort of raised in one narrative, then that same question, actually, you understood it and it was furthered by what you then read in the next sort of chapter in a different time frame till it came together. But that book is also, it starts to be sort of less Jewish than some of the others. But what I really wanted to look at was that relationship between kind of grandfather and grandson. And I've always been fascinated as well. So the main character in it, Fox, is this sort of really sort of brilliant composer, sort of British composer, inspired a little bit by somebody like sort of Vaughan Williams um, and he realizes he has this very difficult grandson who nobody can sort of cope with. And the fox is sort of grieving from the death of his wife, who was a famous singer. I'm often drawn to themes of music and art. And he realizes that the grandson is a kind of a prodigious, a child prodigy at the piano. And I've always been fascinated by the idea of kind of child prodigies and that relationship and what it is to kind of peak at 7 or 8. Like what I'm still waiting to peak. I feel like that's a place to be. And to have that, as a child, I think is really so it was sort of it was both the kind of, yes, the historic situation, but also just that personal relationship. Just for me, that was the way in.
We have a sad reality show history in the United States here of haunted child stars or teen stars, Leif Garrett, the Corey Feldman, Corey Haim, Corey, in a lot of cases they die or they become drug addicts but that peaking early theme, it's tricky to sustain that into adulthood. I mean, Dakota Fanning has kind of done it. Her sister's become a much bigger a star as an adult actress, but everyone
Yeah.
loved her so much as a kid that they're like, whatever she's in, it's Dakota Fanning. But I mean, that poor little fella, Joel Haley Osment, that, as a kid was in everything. And you see, or, Elijah Wood got The Hobbit, I guess, but then that was the end of that. I mean, so he made so much money, he's probably cool, but you just, you can appreciate it. You're right. In terms of some of how that must be a challenge, Justin Bieber, uh, I mean, the irony here, I don't know how it is in Britain, is y'all have certain bands like this too, where it's like you can be a teenage pop star, and then your fans will actually, unlike movie stars or TV stars, they'll follow you into adulthood, and you can still come back on that nostalgic tour trail and play arenas, and they'll still come see you, and they'll bring their kids, and it's New Kids on the Block, are still called New Kids on the Block, like even though they're all in their
Middle-aged
50s.
club. Yeah,
The
yeah, yeah.
Backstreet Boys are approaching their 50s. They go out, they do the dance routines. They're a little slower, but the mothers still scream, and their daughters are like, "What's what?" It's so you're right. It's definitely interesting to see to study that. Whiz Kid Donnie, Paul Thomas Anderson's got a new movie out, but if you watch his one after who was in Magnolia. There's a character that William H. Macy plays called Whiz Kid Donnie, who was like this whiz kid on a TV show and teenagers, and then the whole rest of his life is like cast in the shadow of that fame. So I write with a lot of bands, and you run into some of that with a former member that's a little bitter, and then a book's their chance to sort of remind people that they came up with the riff for X, Y, or Z before the band fired them, or whatever. And it's an interesting thing. It makes you appreciate being an author because you don't normally attain that sort of celebrity, I guess. Like that, maybe 5% of authors attain a kind of rock stardom, like a J.K.
I'd say
Rowling.
less,
Yeah,
much less.
much less, but like a J.K. Rowling or someone, or
Yeah, yeah.
James Patterson. I mean, it's a small. I've interviewed a number of them. I mean, and I consider very fortunate because for every one of them, I can feature like 10 or 15 newer authors, on the weight of that. But it's like still, I wouldn't. Who would want that? I mean, I wouldn't want that. I just could drive me crazy trying to have people taking pictures of you all the time while you're eating, and what have you. And the British tabloids seem especially cruel to their celebrities. Like they can be really enrich, make you famous, but then they can turn on you in like like a flick of a switch, it seems like sometimes, and then turn you into Pete Doherty or somebody. I'm not thinking that's an old example, but anyway. You took a really cool period in London in the 60s and brought it to vivid life in the Gallery of Vanished Husbands. Were you intrigued by that backdrop in that story as much as anything else to sort of start with as a canvas, so to speak?
I was. I mean, that book, that's one of my favorite books actually that I've written. And it's of the character of Juliet. To me, she's kind of stuck between two worlds. So she comes from quite a conservative Jewish background, and her husband just disappears one day. He just walks out and doesn't come back, leaving her with two little kids. And she finds her way sort of almost accidentally. She goes up to London. She's planning to go to John Lewis, the department store, to buy herself a fridge for the first time. Doesn't have a refrigerator. And she ends up sort of blowing all the money on a painting on the Bayswater Road. And this sort of starts for her, this sort of segue into the art world. Because the thing about her is that she's got an eye, she can just spot art and talent. And so all the artists in the book are kind of inspired by real British artists of the period. And I sort of had to kind of understand quite a lot about kind of the process, both kind of intellectually and just practically, of kind of creating paintings and works of this period. But the book is it's sort of a work almost of sort of self-portraiture from Juliet's point of view, where sorry, a sip of water. She commissions each of the artists that she meets along the way to create a portrait of her. And so the whole book is structured like a gallery catalogue, with each chapter being sort of, named after a painting. And sometimes the painting is very incidental to the chapter. It's a paragraph sort of lost and buried. Sometimes the whole chapter is about the process of that painting and her relationship with the artist. Because the idea was that it was kind of a version, we build up our understanding of Juliet sort of through time, through the painting. And of course, the final series of paintings of her is by her son, who becomes an artist. And that was quite inspired by Lucian Freud's series of paintings of his mother as she's dying. And it's sort of about Juliet sort of finding peace with her son. And what's funny about that book is that I wrote it when I was pregnant with my first child, my son. And I was so worried about motherhood, and I was worried about kind of whether I would still have time with the sort of pram in the hall to be creative, whether I'd be a terrible mother because I was so preoccupied with other things. And it really amuses me now just to see all that anxiety kind of expressed helter skelter sort of through that book. And I don't think, and I mean, I don't think Juliet is a great mother. I think it's quite funny to write a book about a fairly dodgy mum when you're pregnant. Um, but it definitely just it expressed so many of my fears. And I don't think I'm quite as absent-minded and forgetful as Juliet, though. Like, I have been known to forget to give my children dinner when I'm really kind of into something. I do feed them later. Like, I don't starve them and put them to bed hungry. But we have had bath picnics before. I can't lie.
From the point of view of a more recent work, specifically I Am Cleopatra, um, what I mean, you have the expertise to take this on, but to
Oh,
really
I really didn't. I really didn't. Not when I started.
well tell us about that. What first intrigued you with her and how do you learn? How do you learn as an already someone that's used to doing, the amount of research you do to pour into your books? How is this a refresher course, if any, to sort of transition into the present?
Oh no, writing I Am Cleopatra was not a refresher course. It was starting from a point of view of knowing very, very little. And it's partly the way I write is that I kind of do a crash course on the sort of topic, whether I'm writing about, so for instance, we sort of talked about the Song of Hartgrove Hall. I needed to know how a composer worked, and specifically the kind of composer who wrote the sort of music that I was describing. So I spoke to lots of musicians and I listened to a lot of music. I spoke to composers, and that was kind of, I immersed myself in that world, writing The Gallery of Vanished Husbands. I looked at a lot of art, I read a lot of books about art, trying to understand that process. And with I Am Cleopatra, I couldn't speak to a lot of ancient Egyptians and ancient Romans, but I just had to kind of it's sort of like doing a crash master's course or a crash PhD in a very sort of constrained amount of time. And I decided to write that book because my previous book, Fair Rosaline, had been a sort of untelling of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, where I reimagined the story from the point of view of Rosaline, who we're told in the play is Romeo's first love. And in my version of it, Romeo is a groomer of young girls. We know that Juliet is not yet 14, she's only 13. And so I wanted to write a story of kind of bad Romeo from the point of view of the teenager Rosaline who gets away. And I had so much fun writing that book. It was so fun. It kind of wrote itself. And afterwards, my publisher was saying to me, "Oh, well, we'd love another kind of Shakespeare reimagining." And I was like, okay. And I was sort of went away and was thinking about it. And I love the play of Antony and Cleopatra, but it also really frustrates me. Like, why is it Antony and Cleopatra for a start? He's a Roman general. She is, okay, yeah, he's one of the triumvirate, but she's a queen. And why is her name not first? And if I say this sort of, the Shakespeare play fails the Bechdel test, you know what I mean? So the Bechdel test, for anyone who's not sure, is it's when you have two female characters in a scene, whether it's in a book or a movie or a TV show, and they're doing something other than talking about a man. And Cleopatra, in Antony and Cleopatra, fails the Bechdel test. In almost every scene, she's there speaking with the women of her court, saying, "Do you think Antony still fancies me? Because I'm getting a bit old. Does Antony still fancy me?" And she says it in the most glorious iambic pentameter known to mankind. And the metaphor, it's beautiful, but she's essentially just worrying like a sort of sorority girl. Does my boyfriend still like me? And we're told that she's this kind of brilliant politician and ruler, and I kind of felt great, but we're not seeing that. That's not the Cleopatra we see on stage. And I wanted to see that Cleopatra, and it's sort of chasing in the dark to try and find her. But that was the story that I wanted to tell. And I then went back and I was rereading Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar is not my favorite Shakespeare play. I find it's a lot of men in rooms talking. And the thing that I don't understand is that Cleopatra is in Rome at this period, but Shakespeare makes the most bizarre creative decision of all time where he leaves out Cleopatra. I mean, who does that? Who's kind of, oh, I don't know, is she interesting? Let's just leave her out. So I kind of wanted to put Cleopatra back into that part of history where she's there staying in Caesar's villa sort of in the lead up to the Ides of March, and to tell that story. For Cleopatra, it's worse because the husband that her father finds for her is her own brother twice. She marries two of her brothers. I mean, there's no evidence that the marriages were consummated. They were probably, dynastic marriages. But in previous generations, the sibling marriages absolutely were consummated and children were produced. So, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say with sort of creating dialogue that I I was sort of tying myself into knots trying to create sort of authentic ancient Egyptian-esque dialogue. I don't even know how one would go about doing that. I don't know what ancient Egyptian really sounds like particularly aloud. I don't know what the accent was. I don't know the sort of so and writers have always made that leap of imagination. If you go back to Shakespeare with Antony and Cleopatra, sort of Shakespeare is he's writing for an Elizabethan audience. So always, as a writer, what you're trying to do is create the characters for this generation, for the people who want to read this book, encounter these characters now. And that feels like a sort of, it is an intellectual tightrope because the Cleopatra that I create, she has to feel like Cleopatra. She has to feel like an ancient queen. That sort of sense of herself is that she is, you know, divinely ordained to rule, and that also she is part goddess. And she believes in that in the same way that we believe in kind of sunrise or taxes. She believes she's a goddess. And there's something very other about that. I've alluded to the sibling marriages. She knows that, you know, certainly one of her brothers is without doubt out to kill her. He starts a civil war. So she's sort of ruthless and brutal in her understanding that he must die. Again, that's something very different, you know, and distancing for a modern reader, where we tend to frown upon murdering one's siblings. And yet within the ancient world, there's absolute logic in her decision. And it's not sort of a psychopathic desire for blood. It's actually a kind of human need for survival. And yet it's still, we see those sort of traits at a distance because it's so other and different from us. So then the tightrope comes in. We're having to make her sort of identifiable enough to a modern reader that they are able to follow her journey and want to and find it interesting. And so in that way, it feels like trying to earth lightning, where she feels like Cleopatra, and yet also she feels human enough that we invest in her story. And so one of the ways that I would sort of do that is by finding her vulnerabilities, because as soon as somebody is vulnerable, even if they're a queen, even if they're the kind of richest, most powerful person, when they're vulnerable, then we can see sort of we can empathize. And I think the kind of the vulnerability I found for Cleopatra really is love. That initially her love for her friend Charmian, who's her kind of slave girl, but also her sort of closest confidant. And then later on, her love for her son, the son that she has with Caesar, a little boy called Caesarion. And everybody in Rome wants to kill him. It's just sort of scorpions everywhere. And her desperation to kind of protect the interests of this child, that suddenly she, yes, she's a queen, but she's vulnerable. And what does she care for anything without her son? I mean, there was a sort of a number of reasons that I wanted to do that. Was that initially I wasn't brave enough when I first started drafting the novel to write Cleopatra in the first person. It was a sort of third person, and I sent some samples to my editor, and she was kind of, look, if you're going to do this, you just have to be brave enough. We need to hear from Cleopatra. And I wanted to see Cleopatra a little from the outside so we could have somebody else's point of view of her. But the other part was, I mean, I did kind of fall in love with Sevilla as I was researching. Sevilla is a Roman matron. She's Caesar's sort of longest lover. That Caesar was sort of notorious for having, you know, thousands of lovers during the course of his life. Yet the constant wasn't, you know, he was also married several times, but the person who is the constant is this woman, Sevilla, who we don't know exactly how old they were when they sort of started their relationship. It could be when they were teenagers, it could be in their early 20s. But what we do know is that when Caesar died in his 50s, he was still in a relationship with Sevilla. The other women sort of came and went, but Sevilla was this constant. And I found that Sevilla offered this sort of juxtaposition to Cleopatra, that we think of Cleopatra as kind of having sort of in some ways kind of so much power, and yet what she doesn't have power over is sort of her own body, who she chooses to love, who she chooses to give her body to. Every decision she makes is that of a queen and as a ruler. So that when she goes to see Caesar and she's sort of taken to him when she's sort of 19 or 20 and Caesar's in his 50s, and the sort of iconic moment that we know of from whether it's from you know Elizabeth Taylor or whether we know it from Plutarch or the descriptions in Shakespeare, when Cleopatra is carried to Caesar sort of wrapped up whether in a carpet or a laundry bag. Her country's at civil is in sort of in civil war. Her brothers sort of got the upper hand in the conflict, and her life, her country, her rule, everything depends on Caesar siding with her. And her tool of state in that moment is her body, and she accepts this. And there's both power in that and also powerlessness. This sort of, kings don't have to do this, queens do. And the thing about Sevilla, in contrast, is that although she seems to be traded by the men of her family like a Pokemon card for sort of different husbands, and they come and go, she chooses really quite young that whatever happens, she's going to love Caesar. She never marries him, but she loves him. They have a sexual relationship, they're very close. And to me, this idea of love as a choice and a decision gives her this tremendous power and this tremendous autonomy in a way that Cleopatra never has it. She has to be with Caesar, and sort of it's out of the time frame of the novel. But there's her relationship with Marcus Antonius. All the relationships Cleopatra has, they are political and they are measured and they are in the interest of Egypt as well as I don't think she really considers particularly the interest for herself as a woman. And that contrast really, to me, was very powerful.